Hey, welcome. Today, we're diving into a story so many of us think we know, right? But what if we've been missing a huge piece of the puzzle this whole time? We are going to look at these events through their original, first century Jewish context. And trust me, you might be really surprised by the deeper meanings we're about to unlock. Let's get into it.
So, right off the bat, here's something that might surprise you. The stories aren't always told in chronological order. And that's not a mistake, not at all. It's actually a signal, a kind of wink from the authors. They're telling us to look for the deeper meaning, not just a simple timeline. It's our invitation to look past the surface and figure out what's really going on.
And that really is the heart of what we're talking about today. To truly get the meaning behind the words, behind the actions, we have to go back. We have to immerse ourselves in that world. It's about restoring the story to its original vibrant color and seeing it the way the very first audiences would have. Okay, let's start with something fundamental, the relationship between Jesus and his disciples. We tend to think of it as just a charismatic leader and his followers. But the reality? It was much more structured, built on a classic cultural model, the rabbi and his apprentices. This wasn't some casual thing. The phrase rabbi and mori points to a really deep, formal apprenticeship. The disciples weren't just fans hanging around, they were students who had dedicated their entire lives to learning from and becoming just like their teacher. This was a hugely respected path in first century Judaism. So let's take the most famous of these apprentices, Simon. Jesus gives him a brand new name, Peter. Now, we might just see that as a nickname, but in this culture, a name change was a massive deal. It was a profound statement about who you are and what your destiny is. So, what did this new name actually mean? Well, the name Peter comes from Petra, which means solid rock. And here's the amazing part. Rabbinic tradition used this exact term to describe the unshakable foundation God was looking for when he created the world. So when Jesus calls Simon Petra, he's not just giving him a cool nickname, he's using a powerful cultural symbol to say you will be the very bedrock of this new community. Okay, so we've looked at relationships. Now let's see how this cultural context changes how we see his actions. We're going to take one of the most famous miracles, put it right back in its original setting, and you'll see these incredible layers of meaning that often get lost in translation. The wedding at Cana. We all know the story, right? Jesus turns water into wine. It's often seen as his first big ta-da moment, a display of power. But for the people who were actually there, it was so much more than that. It was an act tied directly to the holiness of the event itself. See, in Hebrew, a wedding ceremony is called kiddushin, which literally means sanctification. This wasn't just a party. It was a sacred, holy ritual from start to finish. Every single element was steeped in tradition and religious meaning, which makes what Jesus did next even more profound. A first-century Jewish wedding wasn't just a one-day affair. It was this whole multi-stage process, from the formal betrothal, or erusin, to the signing of the marriage contract, and then finally the ceremony under the wedding canopy, the chuppah. This was a deeply structured and sacred event, and that sacredness is the absolute key to what happens next. And right in the middle of this sacred event, the Gospel of John points out a very specific, very curious detail. There were 6 large stone water pots. 6. Why that number? And why were they even there in the first place? Well, the answer changes everything. Okay, here is the crucial point. These jars were not for drinking water. Their entire purpose was for the Jewish custom of ritual purification, which was absolutely essential for maintaining the sanctity, the kiddushin, of the wedding. So Jesus didn't just grab random containers. He chose the very vessels dedicated to ritual purity. He wasn't replacing the tradition. He was fulfilling it in a new, incredible, and abundant way. All right, let's pivot to another iconic scene, Jesus overturning the tables in the temple. It's so often painted as this moment of pure rage against the entire religious system. But again, when we look at the historical context, a much more specific and nuanced picture emerges. This is the question we have to ask ourselves. Was this an outsider trying to tear the whole system down, or was it an insider trying to reform it from within? All the details point to the second one. What's so fascinating here is that these services, the money changing, the selling of animals, they were actually necessary. Think about it. Pilgrims were coming from all over the Roman Empire. They needed to change their money to pay the temple tax in the right currency. And they needed to buy unblemished animals for sacrifice, just as the Torah required. The problem wasn't the services themselves. It was that the high priestly family of Annas was running a corrupt monopoly and totally exploiting the people. So the takeaway here is huge. Jesus' anger wasn't aimed at temple worship itself. It was aimed at the corruption that had infected a necessary part of it. He was acting as a Jewish reformer, trying to cleanse the system and restore its integrity, not trying to burn it to the ground. It was an insider's cry for purity. Okay, for our last section, let's do a quick rapid-fire round on a few key phrases. These are words we hear all the time, but their original meanings are so deeply rooted in concepts that can easily get lost in translation. Let's start with born again. Today, that phrase carries a lot of specific theological weight. But in a first-century context, it was also tied to a real-life event. When a Jewish boy had his bar mitzvah and became responsible for his own spiritual life, he was considered born again into his new role in the community. It grounded this big spiritual idea in a very tangible rite of passage. And what about Son of Man? It sounds so epic. And yes, it can absolutely refer to a messianic figure from the book of Daniel, but in everyday Aramaic or Hebrew, phrases like Bar Anash or Ben Adam were often just a common way of saying a person or a human being, kind of like how we might say some guy. Context is everything. And finally, let's look at a word we all think we understand inside and out, love. But the New Testament was written in Greek, and Greek is a language that has multiple, very specific words for what we just lump together as love, and the difference between them is vital. The two big ones are agape and phileo. Phileo is friendship, brotherly affection. It's the love you have for people you actually like. But agape? That's something else entirely. It's a selfless, unconditional love that you give whether the other person deserves it or not. So when Jesus says love your enemies, the word is agape. He's not asking you to like them. He's commanding a radical act of goodwill and charity. That distinction is absolutely critical. So when you look at it all, from the name Peter to those purification jars at Cana to the tables in the temple, you realize that understanding the original Jewish context doesn't shrink these stories. It makes them explode with meaning. It makes them richer, more textured, and connects them so firmly to the world they came from. You know, putting these events back in their authentic setting reveals all these new layers of intention and meaning. And it leaves us with one last question to think about. How does knowing where any story truly comes from change our understanding of what that story actually means?